I invited my wife to the company couple's dinner as if inviting someone to share a symbolic, intimate, complicit moment. It was a night meant to celebrate two people's stories, journeys built through partnership and effort, a night to laugh with other couples and toast the passing of time. I imagined the two of us there, as we always were, holding hands, knowing smiles, speaking without saying anything, only with our eyes. But she looked away, hesitated for a second that felt like a gaping hole in silence, and said, in the driest voice I've ever heard, "Sorry, I'm going to my boss." That wasn't an answer, it was a break. It wasn't just a refusal, it was a choice. And with it, the end. She didn't know it, but in that moment, everything inside me stopped. Not with anger, not with jealousy, not with rage. But with a silent, devastating grief. Because betrayal begins before the touch, it begins when someone stops looking at you with their soul. And she hadn't looked at me like that in weeks. Only then did I realize that, even though we were still sleeping in the same bed, she had been gone for a long time. I left that room with a silent smile and a storm raging inside my chest. I went to the office, sat down in front of the company lawyer, and filed for divorce. I didn't cry, I didn't tremble, I didn't scream. But signing those sheets was like writing the obituary of our love. A love I'd cultivated for years. A love she'd watered less and less. What was once a garden was now dry land. I would no longer beg for attention, nor compete with anyone. Love is not fought over, nor divided. Love is either whole or a lie. And I had already swallowed too many lies. So, I went to dinner. Not ours, hers. I walked in with my briefcase in hand, wearing the same suit she'd given me for our last wedding anniversary. She was sitting at the table, laughing at something the boss had said. Laughing with her eyes. Those same eyes that once laughed just for me. I approached. She saw me and froze. Her smile dropped halfway before she tried to hide it with a clearing of her throat. The others at the table watched in silence, and I placed the papers in front of her, without looking down. Here it is. Divorce. I wish you bon appetit. And I left. The silence that fell across the table said it all. No one dared speak, no one had the courage to laugh. It was as if the air had been sucked out of her. She stood there, the paper between her fingers, her expression one of someone who, for the first time, understood the weight of a choice. But the most brutal part wasn't what I did. It was what she discovered later. She discovered that he, the boss, the one she'd sacrificed years of building for, didn't want a future. He wanted company. A disguise. Someone to fill the void between meetings. And she didn't realize that's what she'd become, a distraction. She fell into her own trap. And when she tried to leave, it was too late. The phone that used to ring every morning went silent. Her messages bounced back with just a check and a cold space. Those words she thought were promises were just conveniences. He didn't stay. He didn't fight. He didn't even have the decency to explain. He just disappeared. Alone, she began trying to return. Long messages, missed calls, notes left with mutual friends. Letters. Yes, she even wrote letters. She said she missed our nighttime conversations, my hands at breakfast, my calm, the way I knew her in my eyes. She asked for forgiveness for not realizing it sooner, for letting her ego get the better of her. And she spoke of longing, of regret, of wanting to rebuild what she had destroyed. But I was no longer there. Because love that is too neglected fades. Disappears. Dies. Time doesn't heal everything, but it shows us what we never wanted to see, that true love doesn't deserve to beg for presents. I found someone. Without looking. On a random Saturday, in a bookstore, while picking up a copy of the book she said I never finished. She was simple. Not spectacular or flashy. But she had eyes that never wavered, hands that never let go, and a presence that effortlessly filled the space. With her, it wasn't a spectacle. It was peace. And it was everything I needed after the whirlwind I'd lived through. She offered me what I didn't even know still existed: respect, lightness, truth. And a good silence, the kind that doesn't weigh me down. That which once existed, but was lost when my ex-wife traded love for vanity. Time passed. One random Sunday, I was sitting in the coffee shop where we used to go. The new woman beside me, laughing at a silly joke. And that's when I saw her. She was sitting alone, in the corner, with the same look I had the day I left, empty. Our eyes met. There was no hatred. Just a mutual memory of what was and what won't return. She looked at me and smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reunion. It was the bitter smile of someone who realized too late what they lost. She lowered her gaze. She tried to hide it by fiddling with her phone. And I turned my attention to the woman beside me, who was now talking about how the flowers in her window were finally blooming. And I thought, some flowers only bloom after we prune away everything that was creating shade. I forgave, yes. Not to go back. But to move on with ease. And today I know that some pain comes to open our eyes, not to harden our hearts. Sometimes, the love of your life is the one you lose, and only later do you understand its value. But sometimes, losing is saving yourself. The curious thing is, that very night she saw me in that coffee shop, something happened. Something she never told anyone. An action of hers that would reveal the depths of human regret when one discovers the value of a love thrown away. A choice she made, too late, and which she carries in secret to this day. But before revealing what happened, we need to go back to the beginning. To what led us here. Because this story isn't about divorce or revenge. It's about how one choice changes everything, and how silence can say more than any excuse. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or justified. The stories you will hear are fictional, but inspired by harsh realities, created to show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and marks forever the life of those who truly love. Get ready. What's coming next is a story strong, intense, and unforgettable. Sit down, take a deep breath, and be ready to listen one of the most shocking stories you'll ever hear. His name was Daniel. She was Emma. They met on an ordinary September morning in a bookstore where books seemed not only to tell stories, but to connect destinies. He was absent-mindedly leafing through a classic novel when she bumped into him as she reached for a title on the top shelf. The touch was brief, the apology automatic, but the look lingered. There was something comforting in the way she smiled, as if the world around her had a slower rhythm when she was present. Daniel, introspective, attentive to details, was captivated not by what she said, but by what she kept silent. Emma, in turn, was drawn to his calm, a solid presence amidst the hustle and bustle of everyday life. That first conversation stretched on for hours, and by the end of the day, neither of them knew quite where the friendship began and where something more serious blossomed. Their relationship grew naturally. There were no explosive declarations or cinematic promises. Everything happened with the delicacy of someone tending a rare plant, watering it little by little, waiting for the right time for it to bloom. Daniel came from a childhood marked by fatherlessness, which had shaped him into a man who valued commitment and presence. He was the type who remembered dates, who read between the lines, who knew when a woman's silence said more than any words. Emma, on the other hand, grew up amid comparisons and demands. She was the middle child in a family that always expected more of her, more grades, more beauty, more control, and found in Daniel the solace of being able to simply be herself. In the early years, they were nearly inseparable. They shared dreams and fears, building a world of their own, full of small rituals that gave meaning to their routine. The coffee together every morning, the notes left on the table, the walks on Sunday afternoons, everything seemed charged with a greater meaning. Friends said they complemented each other, and perhaps it was true. Where one was fire, the other was water. Where one accelerated, the other balanced. Marriage came as a consequence, not a culmination. They didn't need a grand party or rehearsed vows. All it took was one look at the altar and the silent certainty that they were in the right place, with the right person. These were years of emotional stability, of simple, quiet achievements. They bought a small apartment, which they decorated together. It wasn't luxurious, but it was cozy. Emma changed careers, decided to take a risk in a new field, and Daniel supported her without hesitation. He spared no effort to see her grow, even if it meant giving in to some desires. She, in turn, was a constant presence, encouraging him in moments of insecurity, reminding him of his strength when he doubted himself. It was a true partnership, the kind you don't flaunt on social media, but that is visible in gestures, details, and respect. Over time, however, life began to demand more. The routine grew, responsibilities increased, and the time previously dedicated to the two of them began to be divided between obligations, fatigue, and goals. Daniel began leaving home earlier and returning later, swallowed up by the pressure of the new position he had taken on. Emma, meanwhile, dove headfirst into the competitive environment of the company where she had recently been promoted. She began traveling more, attending corporate events, dealing with people who spoke louder, who took up more space. And, although neither of them realized it immediately, something began to change. Small miscommunications, unresolved silences, unspoken expectations. The connection that had previously been fluid and spontaneous now required conscious effort. But there was still affection. There were still plans. At Friday dinners, there was still laughter. On birthdays, there were still carefully thought-out gifts. When they looked at each other, sometimes they managed to recapture their old spark, even if only for a few seconds. They weren't a couple in crisis, but rather a couple adapting. Real adulthood required more than love, it required patience, willingness, presence. And they tried. Each in their own way, with the tools they had. Daniel remained attentive, trying to be present even when tired. Emma, even absorbed by professional demands, maintained kindness in her gestures, even if her gaze had become more distant. What Daniel didn't realize was that Emma was dealing with a kind of pressure he couldn't quite match. In the new environment she'd found herself in, appreciation wasn't just for competence, but for image, for presence, for an availability that often bordered on the absurd. Being seen, being remembered, being praised, these things began to weigh more heavily than she cared to admit. And, little by little, unintentionally, she began to wonder if the life she'd led with Daniel was still enough for who she'd become. Not that there was a lack of love, but perhaps there was something missing that she herself couldn't quite name. The uneasiness grew, invisible to the naked eye, and Daniel, trusting in the stability they'd built, didn't notice the noise. They still kissed before bed, still shared a bed, a car, plans. But they didn't always share a gaze anymore. Emma began to withdraw more, to talk less about her feelings. Daniel, tired, interpreted this as a phase, as stress. It wasn't uncommon for her to say everything was fine, even when it wasn't. And he, respecting her space, didn't insist. Not out of carelessness, but out of trust. He believed she would seek him out when she needed him. He believed the foundation was solid enough to weather any storm. The weeks passed, commitments increased, and the subtle distance became an abyss. But a silent abyss. No fights, no arguments. Just a growing sense that they were on different wavelengths. Emma no longer laughed at the same jokes, Daniel no longer asked long questions. She threw herself into her work, he into his routine. And yet, in isolated moments, there were glimpses of what had been. A song in the car, an old movie on television, a shared memory. But the glimpses no longer illuminated the entire path. They were merely remnants of a light slowly fading. Daniel still made coffee, still placed her favorite towel in the bathroom, still chose her favorite Friday night wine. Emma still thanked him, still smiled, still pretended not to see. Because, deep down, I didn't want to face what was coming. Something inside her was torn between gratitude for the man who loved her and the restlessness of someone beginning to lose themselves. And Daniel, unbeknownst to him, remained there, steadfast, sustaining a love he thought invincible. That night of the invitation to the company couple's dinner was just another one of his attempts to reconnect. A simple, almost innocent gesture. An attempt to reclaim something he didn't even know was slipping away. He didn't expect a no. He didn't expect the tone of the response. And, more than that, he didn't expect the feeling of being alone within his own marriage. It was then that he understood that something had definitely changed. And that perhaps love, no matter how strong, couldn't survive alone. But before the following days revealed what would happen in the aftermath, before the truth knocked on the door and revealed what was hidden in the averted glances and long silences, there was still much to be experienced. Because not every ending arrives suddenly. Some arrive slowly, wearing the clothes of routine, disguised as normality, until they become irreversible. And while Daniel continued to believe that love endured, Emma silently faced the most dangerous doubt of all, the one that makes someone question whether they're still in the right place, even when everything around them says they are. And it was precisely at this point in the story that the line of destiny began to bend irreversibly, even if neither of them realized it yet. Because when love is set aside, even by carelessness, time takes its toll. And when it takes its toll, it doesn't negotiate. Daniel woke up at the same time every day, drank the same coffee, wore the same shirt, and followed the routine he believed maintained balance in the household. He liked to think that, even amid the pressures of work, he managed to preserve what truly mattered. Emma, increasingly absorbed in her professional life, always seemed one step ahead, hurried, as if her clock ticked faster than his. Daniel noticed the distance growing, but interpreted it as a phase. He believed that, with patience, they would return to their previous rhythm. Love, he thought, would survive the fatigue, the extra hours at the office, the absences. He still prepared small gestures, still insisted on discreet notes, end-of-day questions, invitations for walks or simple dinners. But her gaze rarely lingered on his. Emma was smiling, but it was a different smile. Not the spontaneous smile of before, but a polite, almost automatic smile. And as much as she claimed she was just tired, Daniel missed the intensity in the details. It wasn't just the silence during meals, it wasn't just his cell phone vibrating late at night. It was the feeling that, even when they were together, they weren't truly together. He, however, continued to believe in the solidity of what they'd built. He told himself that the years together spoke louder, that it would pass, that soon they would regain their former brilliance. The first clear sign that something was different came on an ordinary evening. Daniel prepared dinner, nothing elaborate, just her favorite dish, and waited for her to return. When she walked through the door, it was already past 10 o'clock, her eyes tired, her blazer still draped over her shoulders. He greeted her with a hopeful smile, but she merely thanked him, oblivious to the effort. He rang his cell phone before even sitting down at the table. The dish slowly cooled, while Emma responded to quick messages and made hasty excuses. Daniel said nothing. He simply watched. His silence wasn't indifference, but suppressed pain. In the following days, this distance only grew. She spoke less and less about work, as if hiding details she'd previously shared without reserve. The phone rang at odd hours, and she'd step away to answer it. When he asked, he received curt answers, excuses that didn't hold her gaze. Still, Daniel tried to believe. He didn't want to fall into the trap of jealousy, didn't want to become the suspicious man who questioned everything. He wanted to trust, as he always had. He wanted to believe nothing had changed. But inside him, a void grew that he couldn't ignore. Emma, on the other hand, seemed increasingly restless. As if she lived in two distinct worlds. At work, she appeared confident, vibrant, and full of energy. At home, I sank into a tense silence, a weariness that wasn't physical, but emotional. She herself felt trapped between the comfort of the stable life she had with Daniel and the new intensity she was experiencing outside. It was as if, with him by my side, I was reminded of what I no longer knew I wanted to be. Over time, she began to feel irritated by gestures she once considered displays of love. The towel he left in the bathroom, the ready-made coffee, the wine she chose. Everything seemed heavy, as if it were a veiled demand, when in reality it was just care. The invitation to the couple's dinner came in this scenario. Daniel, still trying to rekindle what he felt was fading, believed this would be an opportunity to be together, to show others, and themselves, that they were still a unit. He prepared the proposal calmly, waited for the right moment, and voiced the tenderness of someone who still believes in love. But her response was an invisible knife. She not only refused, but announced that she already had plans for that evening. And not with friends, not with family, but with someone Daniel never imagined he would listen to as an alternative. The shock wasn't immediate. It was a silence that entered the house and never left. After that day, nothing was the same. Daniel tried to act normal, but every word felt weighted down. Emma, for her part, acted as if she hadn't said anything wrong, as if it were normal to prioritize other company on a night that should have been theirs. Daniel felt as if a wall had been erected between them without warning. He tried to talk, but she avoided him. He tried to get closer, but she backed away. He no longer recognized the woman beside him. The following nights were marked by absence. She arrived later and later, the perfume on her body betraying her presence elsewhere. Daniel, alone, stared at the empty bed next to him and wondered when they had stopped walking together. He had no answers, only the growing pain of distrust. He began to notice details more closely, the way she fixed her hair before leaving, the seconds she lingered in front of the mirror, the rush to grab her phone when it vibrated. Everything spoke volumes, even if she didn't say a word. The confirmation came abruptly, on a day that began like any other. Daniel called her late in the afternoon, just to see if she would be back early, and received a vague excuse. Something in her voice, however, betrayed a nervousness he hadn't recognized. He decided to leave. He walked aimlessly through familiar streets until, as he turned a corner, he saw what he didn't want to see. Emma, laughing, her hand resting on another man's arm. It wasn't just professional closeness. It wasn't just admiration. It was intimacy. It was complicity. It was betrayal. Daniel didn't approach. He didn't scream. He didn't make a fuss. He just stood there, his heart pounding, the world around him fading away. The scene was clear, explicit, painful. There was no room for doubt. And it was in that moment that he understood that every silence, every absence, every averted gaze, had a name. The one he never wanted to pronounce. Walking home that night, each step felt like an unbearable weight. The apartment, once a symbol of comfort, was now just a cold space, filled with painful memories. Daniel looked around and realized that none of it made sense anymore. Everything he'd built was crumbling before his eyes. Not because of his lack of love, but because of her choice. And although he didn't yet have the strength to confront it, he knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Because betrayal, when revealed, doesn't just destroy the present. It rips away memories, corrupts recollections, and stains even the moments that were once pure. Daniel silently understood that nothing would ever be the same again. And as he tried to cope with the pain that was still fresh, a certainty grew within him: this wouldn't remain hidden for long. What was about to happen would change not only their lives, but the lives of everyone around them. And the night of the dinner would be the point at which all masks would fall. The night of the dinner arrived shrouded in a stifling atmosphere. Daniel put on his jacket slowly, as if each button fastened marked the end of something he'd been holding on to more tightly than he should have. He looked at his reflection in the mirror and tried to recognize the man there. His eyes were more tired, there was a subtle hardening in his jaw, a silence gathering behind his pupil. But there was also firmness. A resolve that no longer trembled. He picked up the folder resting on the living room table, containing the signed papers, and left without hesitation. He didn't leave a note, he didn't carefully lock the gate, he didn't say goodbye. He simply left, like someone leaving a battlefield with the certainty that they've already lost what was to be lost, and now only the last action remains, to cut what still binds them. The restaurant's dining room was softly lit, filled with couples in elegant attire, hushed conversations, and clinking glasses. Emma sat at the table with the chef, smiling discreetly, as if she felt she was in a prestigious place. She wore a dress Daniel knew, one he'd complimented so many times before, and perhaps, once upon a time, it would have hurt more. But now it was just a detail in a setting he no longer recognized as his own. She walked to the table unhurriedly, without hesitation. When she saw him, her eyes flickered. She tried to maintain control, adjusting her posture, but her discomfort was evident. Daniel, in a firm, low voice, placed the papers on the table, looked into her eyes, and said only what he'd been holding inside, "Here it is. Divorce. I wish you bon appetit." And he left, leaving the silence hanging like a sentence. She didn't pursue him. Not then. But in the following days, she tried to reach out. Short messages, unanswered calls, deleted audios. The penny dropped with the dull thud of loneliness. The man beside her at the table that night, the one for whom she traded her daily routine for implicit promises, became increasingly distant. His interest, once veiled, dissipated as quickly as her messages went unanswered. The supposed romance that had consumed her certainties proved fragile, inconsistent, almost cruel. He didn't care about her silences, didn't care about her dilemmas. He wanted company at dinner, someone to laugh at her jokes, an arm to show off. And when she tried to be more than that, she met a cold wall on the other side. Without Daniel, the house was just home. His scent still on the sheets, his favorite cup in the kitchen, the empty space in the bed. The pain came slowly, like a memory that refused to go away. And with it, awareness. Emma spent days trying to sort out her feelings, in vain. He began to visit the places where they were happy. And so, on a random weekend, he decided to go to the coffee shop where they had coffee every Sunday. An almost desperate attempt to reconnect with something that no longer existed. She sat alone, ordered the coffee he usually ordered, and tried to contain the tremor in her hands. He was looking around, perhaps expecting to see her come in, as if in a dream. And then, he did. But he was not alone. Daniel appeared with another woman at his side. There was no fuss, no posing. Just two calm faces, a light conversation, a loose laugh. Emma froze. That piece on his face was like a punch. Because she knew that look. And now, he wasn't hers anymore. He didn't see Emma. He walked right past her, sat on the other side of the room. And in that instant, she knew, he was okay. He moved on. And she stayed. She spent the next few days trying to cope with what she saw. She relived every scene of their relationship, every gesture, every detail she'd overlooked. She began writing a letter. Not an attempt to win him back, but to understand herself. She needed to express everything she'd been feeling. She spoke of her regret, of how much she missed him, of the pain of realizing that what she'd sought outside never existed. That the love she truly had was within her home. And she'd given up on him. Why? She couldn't answer clearly. She only knew she wanted to go back in time. She decided to deliver the letter in person. She arranged a quick meeting with him at a discreet cafe, and he accepted. When they met, the atmosphere was tense but restrained. Daniel was calm, almost distant, but not hostile. She handed him the letter, tried to smile, and began to talk. She said she was sorry, that she felt lost, that she recognized how much he had given himself for her. She spoke of the empty nights, of the gestures she now missed, of how everything seemed meaningless. And then, with tears in her eyes, she said what he hadn't expected to hear, "You were my home. I destroyed that." "I know." Daniel listened in silence. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he took a deep breath and simply said he'd forgiven her. Not because he wanted to get back together, but because he no longer wanted to carry the hurt. He said he'd finally understood that love, when it's only one-sided, doesn't last. He said he hoped she'd find herself again. And before he left on the table a dried flower she'd picked for him in their first year of marriage. Until then, it had been kept inside a book. Without another word, he left. But what Emma never told anyone, and what only came to light weeks later, was what she did that very night she saw Daniel at the coffee shop with another woman. It was an act she herself hid, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of fear of admitting how deeply she had shattered herself. After leaving that cafe, still teary-eyed, Emma returned home alone. Her mind was racing, her hands trembling, her heart sinking into a kind of silent despair. She turned on the car radio, and none of the songs seemed to make sense. She arrived home, threw her bag on the couch, and paced back and forth like someone looking for something they'd lost and couldn't figure out. And then, on an impulse she perhaps didn't even understand, she picked up her cell phone and called him, her boss. The call rang and rang, until it went to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. And then she sent a message. "Do you have a minute? I need to talk to you." Minutes later, the answer arrived. Cold. Dry. Definitive. "I don't think that's a good idea." It was all a moment, that's all. Emma stared at that screen as if it had rewritten the story of her life. That sentence was like an invisible signature of everything she refused to acknowledge. It was there, with her phone still in her hand, that she did something that would forever mark that chapter of her life. He drove to the coffee shop again. He parked across the street. And she sat there, in the car, for almost an hour. Watching. Waiting. Maybe for him. Maybe for herself. She couldn't tell. On the passenger seat, an unfinished letter. Torn up drafts. A gift I would never deliver. And a confession she'd never had the courage to make. Until now. The next morning, he left the letter at the entrance of Daniel's building, with a note attached to the envelope. "I don't want you to read it in anger. Just read it. Then you can forget about me." The letter contained something that would change everything. A secret she'd kept from the beginning, a secret that even she tried to ignore. Something that revealed not only the betrayal, but the truth behind why she'd allowed everything to fall apart. Because sometimes, betrayal begins long before the act itself, it begins with self-abandonment. And what she confessed in that letter, something Daniel would only read days later, would transform his pain into something even deeper. But that would only come later. Daniel held the envelope in his hands as if it were a fragile piece of porcelain. He wasn't sure why he'd decided to open the letter at that moment, sitting in the back of a taxi, returning from a meeting he had little interest in. The city passed by the windows with its usual indifference, people hurried past, oblivious to what was happening inside the car, but inside him, everything seemed suspended. The paper smelled like the house he'd once shared with Emma, and that alone caused him a long-held unease. He read the first few lines cautiously, expecting an apology or some attempt at redemption, but what he found was something much deeper, and disturbing. The letter wasn't long, but each line felt like it weighed a ton. Emma wrote as if she no longer expected anything in return, as if she had finally accepted that the past was irreversible. However, what she confessed there wasn't just regret for a betrayal. It was the revelation of something Daniel could never have imagined. She told him, in raw, disorganized words, that long before she got involved with her boss, long before she allowed her routine to turn into distance, she had already begun to disconnect. But not for lack of love, as he thought, but for fear, fear of not being enough, fear of disappointing him, fear of not living up to the admiration she saw in his eyes every morning. Emma revealed that, as much as she wanted to stay by Daniel's side, she had begun to constantly compare herself to other women he didn't even notice. She felt small in the face of his calm, pressured by an inner perfectionism that silently gnawed at her. And, in a moment of extreme fragility, she sought in someone else a validation she could no longer recognize in herself. It wasn't desire. It wasn't passion. It was weakness. It was escape. And more than anything, it was a desperate attempt to feel in control of something, anything, at a time when her self-esteem was at rock bottom. But the real secret came at the end of the letter. Emma confessed that, weeks before everything happened, even before taking the first step outside her marriage, she had seen a therapist. She was trying to understand what was going on inside her, trying to fight the confusion that was driving her away from Daniel. But in one of the sessions, in the midst of a crisis, she revealed something that even she hadn't articulated until then, that she never felt worthy of his love. That she felt constantly indebted, as if everything he offered was a silent demand that she be a better woman, more attentive, more present, more perfect. And that, because of this, she began to sabotage her own relationship, believing, unconsciously, that at some point he would realize she wasn't what he saw and leave her. So, before that could happen, she did the unthinkable, she was the one who left him first. Not physically, but emotionally. And the adultery, according to her, was merely the visible reflection of an internal giving up that began much earlier. Daniel reread the last words of the letter more than once. She said that if she could go back in time, she wouldn't just change her choice to get involved with another man. It would change the way she dealt with her own insecurities. She would have spoken more, asked for help, allowed him to see her whole self, not just the strong, independent woman she'd always tried to be, but also the fragile, the scared, the one who needed to be embraced. And she concluded by saying that she wasn't writing that letter to ask for his return, or for pity. She wrote it because she no longer wanted to carry alone the truth that crushed her insides. After finishing reading, Daniel rested his head against the car window and closed his eyes. For a moment, he didn't know what to feel. The anger that had plagued him for the past few months seemed to have given way to something quieter. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, but a bitter understanding. He had suffered for someone who, deep down, was also suffering, albeit in ways he never imagined. And this didn't lessen the pain of betrayal, but it gave it a more complex, less Manichaean form. Neither villain nor victim. Simply human. In the following days, Daniel didn't reply to the letter. He didn't seek out Emma. But her image haunted his thoughts, like a discreet shadow moving with the wind. He remembered old conversations, moments when she might have tried to show him signs, and he, trapped in his own certainty that their love was unshakable, couldn't read them. He began to realize that her silence had more layers than he'd thought. That the distance wasn't just hers, but an abyss built between two distinct silences. Emma, for her part, plunged into a process of silent reconstruction. She continued therapy, left the company shortly after, moved to a smaller, more remote apartment, and avoided the places they'd frequented together. Little by little, she began to understand who she was outside of that relationship. She tried to meet other people, yes, but no new connections were making headway. She compared every gesture, every word, every absence. Nothing was enough. Not because she was expecting another Daniel, but because she hadn't yet rebuilt herself enough to allow herself to love again. Months later, chance brought them together again. It was a lecture on human relations, organized by an institution Daniel attended, which Emma, out of curiosity, decided to attend. Seeing him on stage, calm, articulate, more confident than ever, her stomach dropped. But it was at the end of the event, in the lobby, when their eyes met, that she understood the man before her was no longer the same. He saw her. He smiled. A light smile, without hurt. But one that no longer carried any desire for return. She approached. They spoke briefly. They spoke of time, of life, with that restrained politeness that only a shared past can shape. And then, before leaving, Emma looked deep into his eyes and said, "You were the best I had. And I didn't know it." Daniel, with a gentle gleam in his eyes, replied, "You were part of who I became. And I already knew enough." After that, he went on his way. Months passed. Daniel remained by the side of the woman he had met by accident, but who, over time, proved to be there not out of need, but by choice. Someone who didn't save him from pain, but accompanied him as he rebuilt himself. It was a different relationship, more mature, less idealized. There were no grand gestures, but there was peace. And he finally learned to appreciate the tranquility of a love that doesn't need to be constantly proven. Emma, for her part, also found some form of peace. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that integrates it. She began to write, discreetly, about human relationships, regrets, and choices. With each line, she tried to understand herself. And, who knows, help others avoid making the same mistakes. Time, relentless and gentle, set each one on their own path. Daniel, without forgetting, but no longer hurting. Emma, without erasing, but now able to move on. Because in the end, it wasn't just a story about betrayal. It was a story about a lack of communication, about the fragility of silence, about how much can be lost when no one has the courage to show themselves completely. And so, with no unread letters, no doors left ajar, each person continued with what they had built. Because some losses cannot be repaired. But they can be overcome. And sometimes, the greatest revenge is the peace you find after the storm. Life, after the revelation of the letter and that silent reunion in the event lobby, never returned to what it had been, not for Daniel, not for Emma. But instead of tragedy or chaos, what followed was a different kind of silence. A mature silence, made of internal conclusions and words that no longer needed to be spoken aloud. There was no longer room for accusations or empty promises, nor for assumptions or expectations. It was as if time had finally drawn a clear line between past and present, and all that remained now was to deal with what each of them had become from what they had experienced. And, more than that, with what they would no longer experience. Daniel continued his routine, but not as before. Something inside him had changed, definitively. He was no longer the man who loved unconditionally blindfolded, nor the man who had to carry the weight of the other to keep a crumbling relationship afloat. He had learned, through pain and silence, to recognize his own limits and to understand that love is not synonymous with absolute sacrifice. He was now more whole. And for that very reason, he loved differently. The woman by his side, whose presence had come like a light breeze in a period of dense darkness, became more than a new beginning. She became a clean mirror, in which he could see himself without distortion. They lived not an idealized love, but a true love, with mistakes, successes, and, above all, conscious choices. Weekends became less about making up for lost time and more about living in the present. Mornings no longer held the weight of what had been destroyed, but rather the lightness of what was being carefully built. Daniel began working less, leaving his cell phone at home during outings, paying more attention to the simple details. And not because he feared losing someone again, but because he now understood the importance of being whole. He no longer expected grand gestures, nor demanded proof of love. What he desired was real presence, affection without demands, a sincere look. And, for the first time in a long time, he received it in return. Emma, on the other hand, was going through a different process, less visible, more solitary. The decision to leave her old company was just the first step in a chain of renunciations that would gradually put her back on track. She was finally looking at herself honestly. Recognizing her wounds, her patterns of self-sabotage, her tendency to seek outside for what was missing within. She no longer blamed Daniel, nor saw herself as merely a victim of her own choices. He took responsibility, even though it was painful, and this made the process more difficult, but also more truthful. The days when she woke up wanting to try to start over with him became less frequent. She learned, little by little, to transform longing into memory, and loneliness into self-knowledge. One night, sitting on the balcony of her new apartment, she reread the letter she had written to Daniel months earlier. Every word now sounded different. Not because she regretted what she had said, but because she no longer needed his approval to validate what she felt. The pain was still there, but it no longer burned. It was a pain that molded, that taught, that cleansed away excess. She had understood that not all reconciliation happens in pairs. Sometimes, the only reconciliation possible is with oneself. That same night, Emma received an unexpected message. It was from an old friend she hadn't seen in years, inviting her to a short weekend retreat. An event geared toward women who had gone through difficult breakups, losses, and new beginnings. At first, she hesitated, thinking she might not be ready. But then, as if answering a silent call, she accepted. At the retreat, she encountered stories different from her own, but similar pain. She saw women who had been betrayed, women who had betrayed, others who had simply lost themselves in colorless relationships. And there, she found a kind of belonging she hadn't expected. It wasn't comfort, it was recognition. For the first time in a long time, she spoke about her feelings without fear of judgment. She cried, listened, welcomed, and was welcomed. She returned with less weight on her shoulders. Meanwhile, Daniel was invited by a friend to speak at a community center about healthy relationships and emotional intelligence. At first, he declined. He didn't see himself as someone with the authority to speak about love. But after insistence, he reconsidered. He prepared his speech without pre-packaged speeches, only with lived truths. On the day of the event, he calmly looked at the audience and shared, without naming names, the lessons he'd learned from everything he'd experienced. He spoke about boundaries, active listening, and the importance of not ignoring the small signs. And, at the end, when everyone applauded, he didn't feel vain, he felt relief. The pain he'd carried now served a purpose. And it helped him move forward. The two, separated by choices and consequences, were heading in different directions, but parallel in maturity. They had grown where before there had been only destruction. They had found meaning amidst the chaos. But life, with its subtle irony, would cross their paths once more, not to reconnect, not to revive, but to definitively end a cycle. This happened at a charity event, months later. Daniel had been invited to represent the organization he now volunteered for, and Emma, coincidentally, was among the attendees invited by a coworker. When they saw each other, it was different from all the other times. There was no tension, no expectation. Just two glances that recognized each other, but no longer asked anything of each other. They spoke briefly, lightly, as if discussing a story that no longer hurts. Emma talked about the retreat, about the texts she was writing. Daniel spoke of the new phase, the tranquility he had found. And, for the first time, they said goodbye without silence or bitterness. Just a smile that, however simple, said, "I'm fine. And I hope you are too." That night, alone, in different places, they both looked up at the sky. They didn't know it, but they did it at the same time. Each with a glass in hand, each with different thoughts. But deep down, they both knew that this was the true end of the story they had lived. Not a point of pain, but of learning. Because not every love story needs to end in reconciliation to be meaningful. Some stories end in absence, but leave deep marks that shape everything that comes after. And in that silence shared from a distance, there was something almost poetic. Because they had not only survived each other, but had transformed each other. They had finally learned that life rewards not only those who get things right, but also those who have the courage to learn from their mistakes. Time, as always, would move on. But now, it was no longer an enemy. It was simply the road each of them would walk with new steps, in directions where there was no longer room for blame, only understanding. And, even apart, they continued to carry something of each other, not as a burden, but as a living memory of what they once were, and what they would never need to be again. The city was already entering autumn when Daniel decided to accept an invitation to spend a few days in a nearby village, away from the rush of commitments that had piled up since he'd taken on a new project focused on post-divorce emotional reconstruction. It wasn't exactly an escape, nor a spiritual quest. It was simply the conscious movement of someone who had learned to listen to their own limits. The urban pace had become exhausting, and life with his new partner, a relationship that was blossoming unhurriedly, also required pauses. Not to escape love, but to return to himself and continue loving with presence. He needed to breathe in silence and reorganize his thoughts, away from expectations, away from the memories that, even calmed, still surfaced on longer than usual nights. In the small wooden house he'd rented for a few days, Daniel began writing again. He wasn't sure what he wanted to put on paper, but he did it as if cleaning an old room, carefully dusting it off, piece by piece. His words were no longer about pain, nor about guilt. They were about the details that remain when a love ends, the cutlery that still represents two, the movies never seen together, the imagined conversations that never happened. Those small traces of a life together that remain even after the end. But above all, he wrote about the freedom he had gained after losing what, for so long, he had believed was essential. Because now he knew that no love is worth imprisoning oneself. It was there, in this discreet retreat, that he received an unexpected message from a familiar number. No name was saved, but he recognized the number immediately. A single line, without preamble, "Can I ask you something, for the last time?" The response took hours, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the silence they had both built. When he did respond, he was direct, "If it really is the last time, you can." What came next was a simple request, but loaded with implications. Emma wanted to meet with him, not to recapture anything, not to discuss once again what had already been exhausted, but to deliver something that, according to her, belonged to him. She didn't say what it was. She simply asked to meet in a park they both knew well, where, years ago, they had had conversations that defined the beginning of the story that was now reaching a definitive conclusion. Daniel hesitated, but accepted. Not out of nostalgia, but out of maturity. You knew that encounters like these can end a cycle with more lightness than eternal silence. On the appointed day, you arrived early. The sky was covered in thin clouds, and a cold wind cut through the dry leaves already accumulating on the benches. You walked slowly, recognizing the corners of the park like someone running their fingers through old photos. When you saw her coming toward you, you felt a brief tightness in your chest, not of love, but of humanity. Because here came someone with whom you'd shared entire stretches of your life, and no matter how hurt they'd been, there was respect in their shared pain. Emma wore a gray coat and walked with a firm step. Her face was calmer than the last time. When she stopped before him, for a moment neither of them spoke. They just breathed the same air. And then she took a small notebook from her bag, a blue cover worn at the edges, and handed it to him with a silent look. Daniel held it delicately, unsure of what it contained, and she, noticing his expression, said, "It's yours. It always has been. I was just afraid to give it back." He flipped through it briefly, seeing that it was an old diary, where he had jotted down reflections, ideas, and even letters he'd never had the courage to give her during their marriage. And there, among the pages, were small notes from her, replies written after the breakup, attempts at dialogue that never materialized. The impact of that silent exchange was almost stronger than any argument they could have had. Emma said, in a low voice, that rereading it all, she realized how alone they had been for so long, even though they were side by side. She said she wasn't looking for redemption or mercy, but that she needed to return that notebook so he could be whole again. Because part of him was still there, trapped in those words, and she no longer had the right to carry them with her. Daniel thanked her with a simple nod. There was no way to match a gesture that said more than any statement. They sat for a few minutes on the far bench, and there, after so long, they talked not as ex-husband and ex-wife, but as two people finally ready to let the past rest. They talked about new things. She said she was returning to her studies, he said he had reconnected with writing and was building a new, lighter life. There was no tension, no ulterior motives. It was simply a moment of mutual understanding, where each recognized the other not as villain or victim, but as part of a story that, though painful, was real. Daniel then returned the journal to his backpack, looked at Emma, and said he now felt whole. That he could finally look back without the bitter taste of loss, but with the serenity of someone who had learned what they needed to learn. Emma smiled, tears in her eyes, but without sadness. It was gratitude. For him leaving. For him allowing her to rebuild herself. For finally ending that story with dignity. As they said goodbye, there was a brief hug. Not one of longing, but of respect. After that, they walked in opposite directions, without looking back. Daniel didn't need to reread the notebook. He already had all the answers within him. Emma, in turn, returned home lighter, knowing that some stories, even with painful endings, can leave scars that, somehow, are also beautiful. In the following days, life resumed its course, but now with greater clarity. Daniel felt that something inside him had closed off permanently, and this freed him. He began to dedicate himself more to his new relationship, with attentive eyes, with true listening, with full presence. He no longer expected everything to be perfect, but he knew he now had the maturity to love without sacrificing himself. The woman he was with sensed this surrender and, therefore, allowed herself to surrender as well. They shared silences without discomfort, conversations without fear, and routines without boredom. It was a kind of peaceful love, but not for lack of depth. It was peaceful because it was whole. Emma, for her part, began writing her first book. Not as a professional writer, but as someone who needed to express what she had transformed. The title was simple, almost ironic: What Remains After You're Gone. In it, she didn't tell her story exactly, but rather condensed the experiences, lessons, and reflections of a woman who had to lose herself to finally find herself. As she wrote, she cried and smiled. Because each line was a liberation. And each written page was a step further away from the past that, for so long, imprisoned her. The falling action of that story wasn't marked by a dramatic event, nor by major twists. It was marked by quiet decisions, by sincere dialogues, by goodbyes that finally made sense. There were no more loose ends, no more unanswered questions. Each character continued on their way with a greater understanding of what it means to love, and, above all, what it means to lose. Because sometimes, losing someone you love is the only way to discover who you truly are. And that's exactly what happened to them. Separated, they became better. More lucid. More truthful. More free. And even though their story began with broken promises, it now ended with a shared certainty: some pains come to teach. Some losses are, in fact, returns. And some encounters only make sense when they leave us with something we didn't even know we needed to carry. And all that was left now, was just to live. Time, with its silent ability to transform wounds into scars and scars into memories, continued to advance without asking permission. The seasons changed, faces aged, gazes became calmer, more attentive. Daniel, now in a more sober phase of life, had finally found a way of living that didn't depend on compensation. He no longer tried to prove he had overcome anything, nor did he need to cling to a narrative of overcoming. He simply lived. His peace was not made of absences, but of true presence. He lived with his new partner in a small house with a spacious porch and large windows, where the air flowed freely, without weight. They grew plants together, organized simple dinners with close friends, shared books, and respected each other's silences. It was a love that didn't seek spectacle, but offered stability. A kind of love that only blossoms after many storms. Daniel didn't contact Emma again after their last encounter in the park. Not out of pride, but because they both knew everything that needed to be said had already been said. Still, he occasionally saw her in the news, on social media, or in discreet mentions in literary circles. Her book, released months later, had a greater impact than she even expected. It became a recommended read in support groups, read by women in silence, by men in crisis, by couples trying to understand where they had lost their way. What Remains After You're Gone wasn't a commercial success, but a human success. It was a book that put into words what many people felt but couldn't name. Emma began to be invited to events, interviews, and discussion groups. And it was in this new space that she finally understood that her biggest mistake had also become her greatest tool for connecting with the world. But discreet fame didn't bring glory. It brought mirrors. In each story she heard from others, she saw a little more of herself. And this, instead of fueling vanity, reinforced humility. Emma didn't romanticize what she experienced. She didn't hide her own mistakes. Quite the opposite. In the lectures she began to give, she made a point of reinforcing that no one cheats out of absolute malice, but that doesn't make the mistake any less destructive. She spoke about choices, about courage, about the dangerous silence that kills relationships long before the first lie. She wasn't seeking absolution, but rather purpose. And it was on this journey that she understood, with the maturity that only comes after a fall, that some things cannot be undone. Nor should they be. What she and Daniel experienced was real, intense, but not eternal. It needed to be over. It needed to end so that they could finally begin something else, their own freedom. One day, after one of her lectures, a woman approached her. She was crying quietly. She said she had discovered her husband had been unfaithful weeks earlier and that, after reading the book, she understood that she had also contributed to the distance. She said she was willing to forgive, to rebuild, but that, more than that, she wanted to change the way she related. Emma listened, embraced, and in that moment understood the extent of what she had caused, not only in pain, but also in healing. It was life returning, in another form, some of the dignity she had lost. But still, upon returning home, she slept alone. Not as punishment, but as a consequence. Her life had not allowed her a second chance with Daniel. And perhaps that was precisely the strongest proof that she had learned. Because now she understood the value of a love that cannot be betrayed, and knew she no longer deserved it. Daniel, for his part, watched everything from afar, serenely. He never read the entire book. He read excerpts, listened to commentary, but never felt the need to re-immerse himself in waters he had already traversed. He had written his own final chapter, and that was enough. One night, during dinner with friends, someone mentioned Emma's name while discussing a striking passage in the book. Daniel simply smiled and said, "She found what she needed. And so did I." Then he changed the subject. There was no longer a shadow in his voice, no weight in his heart. He was where he was supposed to be, with whom he wanted to be, and that was all. The years passed like leaves blown by the wind. Each forged their own path with the shards that remained. Neither of them crossed paths directly with the other again. Emma walked alone, but whole. Daniel walked accompanied, but free. Both understood that love isn't just about feeling, it's about caring, it's about supporting, it's about choosing every day, even on difficult days. Betraying this pact, even in silence, even in thoughts, is the first step to ruin. Betrayal doesn't just destroy trust. It erodes love at its root, contaminates memories, empties words. And, above all, it transforms people into versions they no longer recognize. Emma had to rebuild herself from shame. Daniel, from loss. But they both survived. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson. This story ends here. Not with reconciliation, nor with revenge. But with maturity. With feet on the ground. With the clarity that some choices cannot be undone. And that, no matter how much one asks for forgiveness, there are things that time cannot restore. The home that Emma destroyed in search of something uncertain was never rebuilt. Life went on, but not at the same address, nor with the same promises. Daniel built a new home, with new values. Emma learned to live with the echo of her own decisions. And, in the end, they both found something precious, the truth. If you've made it this far, with a heavy heart, your mind reflecting on each step of these characters, leave a comment with your thoughts on how this story made you feel. What's your opinion? Do you believe Emma deserved a second chance? Or that Daniel did the right thing by moving on? Your opinion matters and will be treated with respect. Subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Here, each narrative is written to touch you in a real, intense, and unforgettable way. This story is fictional, but its message is true and profound. Betrayal is no ordinary mistake. It destroys homes, shatters identities, erodes trust, and destroys the kind of love many spend their entire lives searching for. On this channel, we neither support nor normalize any kind of betrayal. On the contrary, we show its consequences, its weight, and the depth of the pain it causes. May this story serve as a warning, as a mirror, as a chance to reflect before it's too late. Because true love, the kind built with care, deserves to be protected, and not destroyed by a moment of ego, need, or illusion. Take care of those you love. Choose, every day, not to betray. Not out of fear of loss, but out of respect for what you've built together. Until the next story. And may it not need to be born of pain to teach you about love.